No. Right. No. What is the Tascam thing here? Does this require a mic, or does it pick it up? These mics? Okay. Right, right. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Light is enough. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. I had to memorize that in the 5th grade, and it stuck with me. Oh, do you? Aid with their company, yeah. Right. Yes, I did. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for staying for our Saturday morning, first Saturday series. This morning we have a speaker named Fred Vilbig. He's a native of Texas. He went to the University of Dallas and got a degree in philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, and then he went to St. Louis University where he got his JD from St. Louis U. He's hosted lots and lots of radio talk shows for SJEN, St. Joseph Radio, and they can be heard also on the local Catholic radio station, the Covenant Network. They're featured on Saturdays, I think at noon, or maybe it's 1 o'clock. Anyway, he previously served as president of the St. Thomas More Society here in the Archdiocese. He and his wife Diane have 11 children. They hail from our Holy Infant Church in Baldwin, and he's a Clayton-based lawyer. He specializes in estate planning and corporate law. And this morning, his topic is called In Pursuit of True Happiness. So you've heard him before. We're bringing him back because he's so good. And here he is, Fred Vilbig.
Good morning. Thanks for staying. I need to put the lapel mic on. That's right. I'm not good at this. I just start talking.
That's my job.
Yeah. The one thing Joanne did mention, she was at our parish for a Lenten event, a mission that we had, and she started talking to my wife, and it turns out, unbeknownst to us, they're cousins. It's just what a small world, so it was kind of funny. So you all know who St. Augustine was. He's, brilliant bishop, brilliant, he's one of the early church fathers, wrote, the Confessions, wrote the City of God, all kinds of sermons, brilliant man. But he was an interesting character when he was young. His father was Patricius, I think that was his name, who was maybe an alcoholic, who was maybe abusive, who was certainly a pagan. And then there was his mother, Monica, Saint Monica. It's always good to have a mother who's a saint. And funny story about Saint Monica, we kind of imagined her as being this pious, devout, humble, quiet, woman always praying. Well, there was one time that Augustine was leaving Carthage and was going to Rome, and his mom found out. And his mom said, "Well, when are you leaving?" "Well, Mom, I'm going to sail on the boat tomorrow afternoon." So Monica shows up at the boat the afternoon, and Augustine had left on the morning boat, trying to dodge his mom. But that didn't stop Monica. Monica got on the boat and found him. She tracked him down. She was persistent in prayer. She was persistent in staying after her son, because Augustine really struggled in trying to find himself. He had a mistress, had a child outside of marriage. He never married. He was looking at all of these different philosophies. He was very unsettled. He was trying to be fulfilled. He was a very big, successful orator, and we don't think of that as being a sort of a thing nowadays. But it was like now you turn on the TV and you see the TV stars, or you go to the movies and you see movie stars. Well, they didn't have TV or movie or social media or anything like that. Now they have influencers. I'm still not sure what they are. But they didn't have things like that. They had public speakers. That would be the entertainment. And so you wanted to really hone your skills as a public speaker, because then you would attract more people, you'd get better venues, you'd make more money. And so Augustine was pursuing that route, and he heard about this guy up in Milan by the name of Ambrose. And Ambrose had been a government official, and they had basically entrapped him to be the bishop when the old bishop died. And he was a catechumen at that time. He hadn't even been baptized. So he had to be baptized, confirmed, ordained, and then he was consecrated as bishop. But anyway, so he had heard about Ambrose, and Ambrose was really, really good at public speaking. And so he said, well, I'm going to go listen to Ambrose and see what his tricks are. And so he goes to listen to Ambrose, and he's not so much trying to understand what Ambrose is saying as to learn how Ambrose is saying it. Learn the technique, the strategy, the skill. And later, Augustine said that I went to see how Ambrose taught without meaning to learn what he was teaching, but the teaching seeped in, and it ended up converting Augustine. And he famously said, your heart does not rest until it rests in God. That it was with finding God that he found happiness. There was I'm sure you've heard of the philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle, he died in about the year 322 BC, so 300 and something years before Jesus. He taught that everybody, in everything that we do, we are seeking happiness. If you get a bowl of ice cream, you have that because it makes you happy. If you have a piece of cake, you have that cake because it makes you happy. Even things that are difficult, we do because we feel that in the end, it's going to make us happy. For instance, going to school is not necessarily fun, but you go to school to learn a trade or to get a degree so that you can get a job, and having a job will make you happy. You might, study for a test. If you get a good grade on the test, that will make you happy. So we even do difficult things, but in the end, we are all seeking happiness in everything that we try to do. But the question is, what is going to bring us happiness? What's going to really result in us being happy? One of the things that historically what happened was during the Middle Ages, religion was so central to everything that was going on. And when we got to the point of the 1700s, when science was blossoming, although it did come out of the Catholic Church, I have to say that, when science was blossoming and people were looking at the scientific method, and they were thinking, well, if we cast off the superstitions of religion and base our lives on reason, we'll be happy. And so they did that, and the result, of course, was the French Revolution, which ended up, we ended up with the Reign of Terror and the guillotine. Bishops, priests, nuns, brothers, they were all killed, or they were forced to sign an oath of allegiance to the revolution. If they didn't, they were either exiled or killed. There were the Discalced Carmelite nuns of Compiègne, France, just north of Paris, and they were disbanded. All of the monasteries and convents were disbanded because they didn't want any of that superstition, and they were disbanded, but the community still stayed together, and they would meet. People took them in, and they would meet to pray on a regular basis. Well, this was reported to the government authorities, and they proceeded to arrest them, and they took them to the guillotine, and one by one they were beheaded while they were singing hymns. And anyway, so and they were beheaded, I think it was like 2 weeks before the end of the Reign of Terror. So it was really tragic that happened. But so reason really isn't going to bring us happiness. There's another thing that people think will bring us happiness is power. That if we're in charge of things, if we're in control, that it will bring us happiness. I don't know if you remember the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who said God is dead. He wrote a book called Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Zarathustra was, in fact, I mentioned that to a friend, and he said, "What?" Zarathustra was, in fact, a religious leader in the Middle East, years and years ago, long time ago. And anyway, Nietzsche's book was this wise man coming off of the mountain. It was kind of like a parable. This wise man coming off of a mountain and teaching all of the poor, ignorant people down in the plains. And the guy was Zarathustra, and he had said, God is dead. Well, what Nietzsche wrote about was that what's going to make you happy is not necessarily power per se, but striving for power, which is kind of interesting because I think that fits very well with the idea of power. You're never going to have enough power. You're always going to be paranoid that somebody's going to take something away from you. And so power really isn't what's going to bring you happiness. Another thing that people pursue to find happiness is pleasure. And Sigmund Freud was the psychologist who basically said, he developed this idea of the pleasure principle. He's got the three levels of your psychological makeup. The most basic level is the id, and the id is governed by the pleasure principle. You seek pleasure, you avoid pain. And he says it's almost subconscious that we're programmed in a way. He didn't use that term, but we're programmed to seek pleasure and avoid pain. But later in his life, he wrote a book reflecting on the evils of society. And he concluded that people can never really be happy. They can be content, they can have moments of joy and pleasure, but they're not going to be happy per se. And it was Freud who reached that conclusion. And the reason for that is that the only way that you are going to be happy is with God. That was what Augustine, going back to Augustine taught that we all pursue happiness, but the only way that you're going to find happiness is in God. Aquinas similarly taught that you can't be happy here on earth. Going back to Augustine, he said that anybody who tries to be happy purely with earthly things is going to be miserable. In the end, they're going to be miserable. So it's only in God that we are going to be happy. But I think our society, we like to put God on a shelf. We like to minimize God. We want to make God convenient for us. God really is an inconvenient person, if you think about it. But we like to fit God into our lives, and it's almost like we are making ourselves God, and we're asking God to just be a supporting actor, a supporting player in our lives. But that's a real misunderstanding of who God is. God is, another philosopher, Mircea Eliade, he wrote about how God is totally other. He's incomprehensible. We just can't really know all there is to know about God. But I think that we can learn things about God from nature. In fact, in the letter to the Romans, Paul said that the pagans are not innocent in their refusal to believe in God because God has put into nature everything that we need in order to come to know Him, at least on a basic level. God is infinite. He's limitless. The way that I look at that is, when I was a kid, this was in the 60s. I know you guys are all younger. But it was in the 60s. We were going to the moon, and space was this great frontier. I remember as a child, my parents were terribly abusive. They made me go to bed. They said that I had to have a good night's sleep. It was really horrible. The sun was still up, and I could hear other kids in the neighborhood out playing, and I was sitting there. I was all grumpy and everything. Anyway, I started thinking about the space program. They were going to send somebody to the moon. And I started to think about how far away the moon is. And then I started to think about, well, they want to go to Mars. How far away is Mars? And then I started thinking about the other planets. And back then we still thought Pluto was a planet. So I got out to Pluto in my thoughts, and it was way out there. And I thought, and then beyond that, the distances are so vast, they measure them in light years, which are hundreds of thousands, millions of miles long. But the distances are in light years. So it's immense distance. And, at the time we thought it was just empty space. Now we realize that it's basically empty, but there are particles floating around out there. But the distances are just immense. God created all of that. He's beyond he's not limited by those boundaries. These distances are so huge, and God is there. So God is limitless. God is timeless. They say that the universe was created at the Big Bang, which happened about 14 billion years ago. I think 13.8 billion, but who's counting the 0.2 billion? Who cares? Anyway, but it's this long, long period of time. And they thought what would happen for a long time, they thought the universe was going to expand and slow down and contract again, and there would be another Big Bang. But what they're finding is there's something out there that they're calling dark matter. They've theorized about it because things are not slowing down in the expansion. In fact, things are going faster and faster away from each other, and eventually things are going to end in all the nuclear fuel will be burned out, and there will be just a cold, dark universe, is what they're saying. When I was a kid and I was thinking about this, I actually got physically ill, and I decided to start thinking about my parents and how abusive they were again. But looking at it now, God is timeless. We're looking at distances. It's hard to imagine time, but God was there at the beginning, and God will be there at the end, because God is outside of time. God is timeless. And God is beautiful. Every artist that you see is, whenever they paint something, you see something of the artist in that. And we see beauty all around us. I love your stained glass windows. Holy Infant does not have stained glass windows. My parish doesn't have stained glass windows. And if I had like $10 million, maybe I would pay to have those put up. But, so there's beautiful things in the world. And basically what artists are doing they are trying to reflect something of the beauty that they see in nature around them. And that beauty is put there by God. I've talked before about sunsets and sunrises. Every once in a while, I will walk out of church in the morning and there's a sunrise off in the distance. I'll just stop to watch it. The colors are just beautiful. And God, the artist, is painting that at every moment. So God, who puts all of that beauty into the world around us, God is beautiful. And He's good. We see there's a lot of problems in the world, but there's also just a lot of good things that happen. And anything that's good is rooted in God, because God is good. And we know that God is love because He sent His Son to die on the cross for us. Saint Angela of Felino, not Angela Marisi, but Angela of Felino lived in about the 1100s, 1200s, and she had these visions of Christ talking to her. And she came to realize that, we think of Christ's suffering being His passion and death. But Angela made the point that actually His very incarnation was suffering because of the fact that He left the beauty, the wonderful existence He had with the Father and the Holy Spirit, emptied Himself, became one of us, and lived among us. That His very incarnation was suffering. And it's selfless love, completely selfless. Jesus got nothing out of it. So that's the kind of love that God is. So in order to understand heaven, I think we need to have some understanding of who God is. And if God is all of that, He really should be the center of our lives. Most of us, like I said, we put him on a shelf, but he really should be the center of our lives, because in the end, I think what we'll find out is God is the only reality. He created everything. Everything exists because of him. He sustains everything in being. He's the only reality. We just participate in his reality. And if we push away from him, we're pushing into nothingness. So God is the only reality. So with that idea of God, I think it helps us to better understand heaven. As I said, Aquinas and Augustine both said, you're only going to be happy in the next life in heaven with God. And so, what is heaven? I love St. Paul. I believe it's in his first letter to the Corinthians. He says, eye has not seen, ear has not heard, and the human heart has not imagined what great things God has in store for those who love him. That's not very helpful, St. Paul. It'd be nice if we had a little more detail here. So I started to think, well, what is it that we can look forward to in heaven? First of all, we can look at the risen Christ as showing us an example of what we will be like in heaven. When he rose from the dead, he appeared to Mary Magdalene in the Garden of Gethsemane. She didn't recognize him. When he was walking with the disciples on the road to Emmaus, they didn't recognize him. When he appeared on the shore of the Sea of Tiberias and he told Peter, James, John, who were out fishing, cast your nets off to the other side, and they pulled in this huge haul, they didn't recognize him until John said to Peter, it's the Lord. And it was only then that they recognized him. I think we will be transformed when we are in heaven, and we will be in a glorified state that is beyond anything that we can imagine now. We will be healthy. Jesus spent a lot of time healing people, and sickness, disease, illness, all of that was the result of original sin. So in heaven, we will be healthy. We'll be at the prime of our life, which maybe isn't now. It might be when you're 15, 20, 25, 30, whatever it is, but you will be in the prime of your life. You won't be limited by physical boundaries. When Jesus rose from the dead, all the disciples were in the upper room cowering with fear, and the doors were locked and everything. All of a sudden, Jesus appears to them. So he wasn't limited by physical boundaries, walls and things. And yet, he said, give me something to eat. So that he was substantial. It wasn't that he was a ghost. That was what they thought at first. He was substantial, but he wasn't limited by physical boundaries. There's a great story about Padre Pio. During World War II, the Allies were going to bomb Pietrelcina, which is where the monastery was, that Padre Pio was. And everyone was praying, oh, please, please, God, save us, spare us, Lord, don't let that happen. And so the Allied pilots who were flying, and it wasn't just one pilot, it was several of them. They didn't drop their bombs because they looked out the window and there was Padre Pio flying beside them. And they decided, we better not drop our bombs, and they went someplace else to drop the bombs. And they had to go back and tell their superior why they didn't drop bombs on Pietrelcina. And at first they thought they were all insane, but it turns out everybody's story was exactly the same. And they hadn't talked to each other. So they said, well, something odd happened here. In heaven, we will be able to go from one place to the next without any kind of limitations. So our bodies will be transformed. Creation will be transformed. There's St. Paul says that the world is groaning, waiting to be released from the bondages of sin which were brought on by us. And I think that what's going to happen is that the veil that's cast over creation as a result of original sin, that veil will be pulled back, and everything will reflect the glory of God. The Psalms talk about how the valleys and fields will sing. It's interesting, they found in I don't know how they do this, but they were listening to the universe, and there's actually a tone in the universe that's a constant tone that underlies everything. It's inaudible to the human ear, but they were able to pick it up. But I think that creation will sing. It will radiate the glory of God, so that everything that we see will reflect God to us. I think that the Garden of Eden, is an interesting image. Some people think that what's going to happen is the Garden of Eden will be restored. Mark Twain wrote a book. It was probably the last book that he ever wrote. In fact, it's really incomplete. It's unfinished. He was writing it when he died. It's called Captain Stormfield's Visit to Heaven. It's a riverboat captain. It's Mark Twain, so it's got to be a riverboat captain. It's a riverboat captain, and he goes to heaven. Now, of course, he's going to heaven on a riverboat, and he starts racing another riverboat, and he goes to the wrong place. It's all kinds of little things that happen. But he gets to heaven, and he's really looking forward to getting his harp and his wings. So he gets in line to get that, and it's a long, long line. And so as they're walking up slowly to get their harp and their wings, he notices people coming back are dropping their harp and their wings by the side of the road, and he doesn't understand that. He goes up and he gets his harp and his wings, and he's all excited, and he's walking back this long distance. The excitement wears off. They're heavy, clumsy, so he dumps his on the side of the road as well. He finds the place where he's supposed to live. He meets some people. He has everything that he could possibly have wanted on earth. He met important people when they had time to meet with him, of course, but he would meet them. They would pop in for some event, and then they'd pop back out and they'd disappear. But after about 10,000 years, this got pretty boring because it was just earthly. And I think there are a lot of people who look at heaven as being just this earthly paradise, like Eden. But the thing that will make heaven so much different is God will be there. Now, the mystics have talked about how in heaven we will be able to sit and look at God, look at the beatific vision of God. And I've had people walk up to me and say, well, that doesn't sound very exciting, just sitting there staring at God for all eternity. But again, I think that's based on a misunderstanding of who God is, like we talked about earlier. The mystics, if you listen to them, I think that's the closest that we are going to get to having an understanding of what heaven is going to be like. St. John of the Cross lived in the 1600s. He wrote several poems, really, and then he wrote commentaries on the poems. They are still revered as some of the best poetry ever written by a Spaniard. And, very, very religious, of course. And he's talking about his experience of God. And I think maybe poetry is a good way to try to express that experience. He referred to the union with God as being a spiritual marriage, that you were absorbed into this loving, beautiful, overwhelming person who is God, infinite person. You will never reach the end of who God is. Teresa of Avila was a contemporary of John of the Cross, and actually was I think John of the Cross was her spiritual advisor, and they formed the Discalced Carmelites. They broke off from the Carmelites. Teresa also talked about how in heaven there will be this spiritual marriage with God, and it's inexpressible, the beauty and wonder and glory that will be ours in heaven. And a more recent person, a more recent mystic, is St. Faustina. And St. Faustina talks about how in heaven you will be just totally overwhelmed by the wonder of God, that it's just incomprehensible. And the problem that I think we have in our society is we don't appreciate, number one, who God is, or number two, what heaven is. If people really understood what heaven was, I think we'd have a very different society. In our society, we pursue happiness in all kinds of ways. The saying that people have, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They pursue happiness in pleasure. They pursue happiness by avoiding reality through drugs. They try to be happy with music and entertainment. But if those things really brought us happiness, we'd have a lot of happy people in our world. But we don't. It's so sad. If you look at the paradigms of our society, they seem really unhappy. They take drugs in order to numb themselves. I don't know if any of you have been following the trial. My wife has been following the trial with Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, I guess it is. And she'll come and she'll say, "Oh, do you know?" And she'll tell me. I think, "Oh, I feel sorry for them." And I understand that there's a lot of pressure, but I just don't. They really are miserable. Sports stars, rock and roll stars, movie stars. It almost doesn't matter. They're all trying to be happy, and yet they seem to be so unhappy. People are surprised when somebody commits suicide. One of these successful paradigms commits suicide, but I almost wonder, it's more amazing that more of them don't, because they just seem to be so unhappy, and our society seems to be racked by so much unhappiness. The only place we're going to find happiness is in God, and the only place we're going to find true happiness is in heaven. That's what we should be striving for in every aspect of our lives. Union with God so that we can be in heaven. Thank you very much for listening. God bless.
Thanks for shortening your speech from 50 pages to what we just heard. As you were talking, it reminded me of the first reading from Easter Sunday. The words just came back to me over and over again, because what you were talking about was in the gospel just a couple weeks ago. It says, "Brothers and sisters, if then you were raised with Christ, seek what is above, when Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Think of what is above, not of what is on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. And when Christ, your life, appears, then you too will appear with him in glory." That was from St. Paul's Gospel or Epistle to the Colossians. Thank you for staying. We appreciate your attendance, and next month we will have another Saturday speaker. Thank you.